In this video, I am sewing the Mykonos shirt pattern from fabricstore.com. The Mykonos pattern takes inspiration from men's casual tailoring. The button front shirt is semi-fitted with a camp-style collar, front and back yoke, and 2 sleeve options. The Mykonos pattern has many pockets for those who love pockets. The shirt has 2 at the chest seam and 2 in the side seams. This is an advanced skill level sewing pattern. Fabricstore.com premium patterns are printed on professional plotting paper with 4 sizes printed clearly on the roll. Patterns arrive rolled in a tube, include a fully illustrated instruction booklet, a pattern card for easy reference, and a pattern hook. The instructions for view A and view B are all the same until you get to the sleeves. In this video, we will cover view B, which is the long sleeve version. The fabric you will need for this sewing project is a woven linen that is at least 55 inches in width. I am using the IL019 all-purpose dried herb signature finish linen. You will also need a lightweight woven fusible 36-inch width interfacing, as well as an all-purpose thread. For view A, you'll need 8 shirt buttons, and for view B, you'll need 10. These can be from 3/8 of an inch to 5/8 of an inch diameter. And in this video, I will be using a contrasting thread on the serger, and that will be to show you in a clear way on the video which edges are serged. To begin, make sure you pre-wash and dry your linen fabric in the same manner you would your finished garment. This will soften your fabric and eliminate further shrinkage. Press out any deep creases or wrinkles using your iron steam setting with high heat. Next, I'm going to place my pattern pieces on the fabric with the grain line arrow markings running parallel to the selvage grain of my fabric. I'm going to transfer the markings indicated on the pattern to the fabric using a water-soluble pin in some places, as well as fabric shears for notches. You can use your preferred method. And to ensure that my seams will last a long time, I'm going to use a stitch length on my sewing machine at 2 millimeters. This is about 12 to 14 stitches per inch. This will make for a very durable seam. Throughout my sewing process, I am going to press my seams as I finish them, as well as clip any extra threads, and this will create a clean, tailored look. I will be using the L pattern piece and M pattern piece, and I'm going to lay the L pattern pieces mirrored in front of me with the wrong sides facing up. Now I'm going to interface the wrong side of each pocket opening with chest pocket fusing. This is the pattern piece M. On the right side of the pocket, I'm going to mark the placement of the inner buttonhole. Now I'm going to switch over my presser foot to a buttonhole presser foot and then sew the buttonhole and cut the opening. With the right sides together, I'm going to align the interface chest pocket piece to the front shirt. This is pattern piece A. Now sew at 1/2 inch seam, stopping at the notch. Using my iron, I'm going to press the seam allowances open, turn the back pocket to the inside of the shirt with the wrong sides facing together. Now I'm going to neatly press the seam. Next, I'm going to use the front yoke, which is the B pattern piece, and align it with the non-interfaced pocket with the right sides together. Sew a 1/2 inch seam, stopping at the notch. Press seam allowances towards the front yoke. Align the front shirt and front yoke with the right sides together. I'm going to make sure that the pocket is pushed to the side so I don't sew it in place. I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam stopping at the notch. Next, I will press the seam allowances open. With the right sides together, I'm going to align the center fronts of each set of chest pockets. Sew across the top edge with 1/2 inch seam allowance, stopping at the notch. To finish, I press the seam allowances open. With the wrong sides facing up, align and pin the seam allowances of the front yoke and the chest pocket close to the stitching lines, making sure to not go over. At the right side of the front shirt, top stitch the seam 1/16 of an inch, starting at the center front and stopping at the beginning of the pocket opening. At the same section, I'm going to sew a parallel row of stitches at 1 3/16 of an inch. Now I'm going to move along to sew the pocket bags. Align the chest pockets together along the side and bottom. Sew a 1/2 inch seam. Finish the seam allowances with an overlock stitch, including the upper seam allowances at the front yoke. Align the corner of the pocket with the dot marking on the wrong side of the front shirt. From the wrong side, I top stitch through the pocket and front shirt. Begin stitching at the seam between the pocket and front yoke, perpendicularly down. Then on top of the seam between the pocket. Sew a second row of stitches at 1/4 inch. Neatly press the finished pocket. I am going to repeat these steps for the other chest pocket. Now I'm going to sew the side pockets. With pattern piece O, I'm going to interface the pocket fusing to the wrong side of the front shirt at the pocket opening between the notches. With right sides together, I matched up the notches of the side pocket, pattern piece K, to the seam allowance of the front shirt. I sewed a 1/2 inch seam with horizontal stitching at the beginning and end of each notch. With my fabric shears, I carefully clipped diagonal at the corners, stopping just before the stitching, finishing the seam allowances together with an overlock stitch. With the right sides facing up, I understitched the seam allowances to the pocket 1/16 of an inch. Now I turned this pocket to the wrong side and neatly pressed. With the wrong side of the front shirt facing up, I top stitched the opening of the pocket at 1/4 inch. With the right sides together, I aligned the remaining side pocket to side front pattern piece C, matching the notches. Sew a 1/2 inch seam between the notches. Now I'm going to place the pockets right sides together, matching the perimeters. I will sew this together with a 1/2 inch seam, overlocking the seam allowances together. With the right sides together, sew front shirt to side front with 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll use a stay stitch on this pocket to the center front shirt at 1/4 inch. Now I'll finish the seam allowances together with an overlock stitch, neatly pressing towards the front. With the right sides facing up, I will top stitch the side front seam 1/4 inch in the following steps. First, I will sew from the armhole to the top of the pocket opening. Second, the inner opening of the pocket bag. Third, from the bottom of the pocket opening to the bottom of the hem. And finally, I will sew horizontal back stitches at each end of the pocket opening. I'll use an iron to neatly press this to finish. Next, I will sew the back of the shirt. According to the pattern marking and notches, I am folding the pleats of the back pattern piece D and creating a stay stitch in place at 1/4 inch. Now I will take the right sides of the back yokes, which is pattern piece E, and place them together. I am sandwiching the back shirt inside the 2 yoke layers at the horizontal seam allowances. Sew a 1/2 inch seam. I unfolded the back yokes right sides facing out, neatly pressing the seam allowances towards the back yokes. I will top stitch the yoke seam 1/4 inch. I am going to sew the shoulder seams. I'm laying the back shirt wrong side facing up, folding down the back yoke away from the yoke facing. With the right sides facing up, align the front yokes pattern piece B to the shoulder seams of the back yoke facing. Stay stitch at a scant 1/2 inch. Now it is time. I'm going to do the burrito method. Starting at the hem, I rolled up the front and back shirt pieces upwards towards the shoulders, stopping once I have exposed the unsewn shoulder seams of the back yoke. Now I folded up the back yoke to align the right sides together at the shoulders. I used pins as needed. I sewed this with a 1/2 inch seam, being careful not to catch the rolled up fabric. I turned the back yokes right sides facing out and neatly pressed the seam allowances of the shoulders towards the back yoke. I top stitched at 1/4 inch and stay stitched the back yokes together a scant 1/4 inch at the neckline. Now I'm going to sew the side seams. With the right sides together, I align the side seams of back and side front matching the notches and sew this at a 1/2 inch. I finish the seam allowances together with an overlock. Press this towards the back. Now I'll top stitch the seam allowances to the back shirt with right sides facing up. I'm going to grab my front facing to sew this together. All of the following steps for the front facings repeat for both sides. I will use pattern piece J to interface the wrong sides of the front facings. Next, I overlocked the outer raw edges of the facings. I turned this and pressed the edges 1/4 inch to the wrong side, top stitching the folded edge 1/16 inch. With the right sides together, I aligned the front facing to the front shirt. and I sewed this at 1/4 inch seam. Working from the wrong sides, I clipped notches of the seam allowance at the lapel end point, and I neatly pressed the lapel seam allowance towards the front yoke. With the remaining center seam allowances, I pressed this towards the front facing. I turned the right sides facing up and understitched the seam allowances to the front yoke, starting at the top of the neckline and stopping at the clipped notch of the lapel end point. I continued the stitching with a slight shift to understitch the remaining seam allowances to the front facing. At the top of the neckline, I trimmed off the corner of the seam allowances, turning the facing towards the wrong side of the front shirt and neatly pressed. Now I will sew the collar. Interface the wrong sides of the collar pieces I and H. Now I'll align the straight edges of the upper collar and under collar with the right sides together, sewing at 1/4 inch seam. I trimmed the corners of the seam allowances toward the under collar. I understitched the seam allowances to the under collar at 1/16 inch. With the right sides together, I folded the collars and sewed the short ends 1/4 inch, trimming the corners of the seam allowances. I turned the collar right side out and neatly pressed. At the back neckline of the upper collar, I turned under the seam allowances between the notches 1/2 inch to the wrong side and pressed. I aligned the under collar to the shirt neckline with the right sides together, sewing a continuous 1/2 inch seam, carefully moving the back neckline area of the upper collar. I used my fabric shears to clip the neckline seam allowances as needed to release tension and clip the notch at the yoke seam, pressing the seam allowances of the back neckline up inside the collar. Next, I neatly pinned the pressed seam allowances to the upper collar over the seam and top stitched at 1/16 inch. I turned the shoulder edge of the front facing 1/4 inch to the wrong side. With right sides facing together, I pinned the neckline seam allowance of the facing to the neckline seam allowance of the front yoke, pinning this in place as needed. I sewed the front lapel edge 1/4 inch and continued stitching the neckline and collar layers with the remaining 1/2 inch seam allowance. Working with the wrong side of the facing, I sewed through the previously pressed shoulder seam allowance of the facing to the neckline seam. I carefully trimmed the neckline seam allowances of the facing to 1/4 inch. Next, I edge stitched the previously pressed shoulder seam allowance of facing 1/16 inch through the back yokes. Now I will sew the hem, which is views A and B. Stay stitch the hem edges a scant 1/4 inch. Turning the edges 1/2 inch to the wrong side and press. Now I tucked under the raw edge 1/4 inch and pressed. Starting at the back side seam, I top stitched the hem 1/4 inch continuously around the bottom, center fronts, and collar until I arrived back where I started. I finished this with a neat press. This is where I began sewing my sleeves. At this point, I'm going to sew view B, which is the long sleeve version of this shirt. If you are sewing the short sleeve version, there are fewer steps and you can find these outlined in your instructions. To prepare my sleeve, I cut the slit of the sleeve, which is pattern piece F, according to the pattern marking. With the sleeve wrong side facing up, I placed one edge of the bias pattern piece in along the slit with wrong side facing up. I sewed a 1/4 inch seam and pressed the seam allowances towards the bias strip. I turned under the free edge of the bias 1/4 inch and neatly pressed. I turned this piece of the bias again towards the right side of sleeve to cover the slit seam allowances, top stitching at 1/16 of an inch, neatly pressing. Folding the sleeve with the right sides together at the slit, I sewed several 45-degree back stitches at the top fold of the slit bias. Locating the side of the slit furthest from the back of the sleeve, I turned the bias towards the wrong side and stay stitched this in place at the bottom edge. I folded the sleeve right sides together and aligned the inseams, sewing 1/2 inch seam overlocking the seam allowances together. I interfaced the wrong sides of each cuff, pattern piece G, and I pressed under the long edge 1/2 inch to the wrong side. This is the side without the notches of each cuff. Next, I aligned the bottom edge of the sleeve to the unpressed edge of the cuff, with the right sides together, matching the notches. I sewed this with a 1/2 inch seam. I pressed the seam allowances down towards the cuff, folding the cuff right sides together at the notch of the short sides, sewing the short ends 1/4 inch. I turned the cuff right side out and neatly pressed, aligning the previously pressed edge of the cuff over the exposed seam allowance. I used pins to make sure that the folded edge covers 1/16 of an inch beyond the stitch line. With the right sides of the cuff facing up, I carefully stitched in the ditch at the previously sewn seam of sleeve and cuff, catching the seam allowance of the cuff edge underneath, top stitching the sides and bottom of the cuff 1/4 inch. And moving forward, all of these instructions are for view A and B. With the right sides together, align the seam allowances of sleeve to armhole seam allowances, matching all the notches. I'll sew this at a 1/2 inch seam and finish the seam allowances together with an overlock stitch. Now I press the seam allowances of the sleeve cap area towards the armhole, and I top stitch through all the layers between the front notch and back yoke seam. I am going to sew the front buttons and buttonholes, switching out the presser foot on my sewing machine. At the right front of the shirt, I will sew and cut the buttonholes according to the markings previously transferred from the pattern. I will hand sew on 6 buttons to the left front shirt at each button marking. I am sewing and cutting the buttonholes on cuff according to the previously made markings, sewing on the button for each cuff where it is marked. And finally, I'm sewing the chest buttons. At the inner chest pocket, I am marking the button placement to align with the center of the previously sewn buttonhole. I will finish by sewing a button to each pocket. Congratulations, you have finished your beautifully tailored Mykonos shirt. For more patterns, see our website, fabrics-store.com, and for additional assistance, contact us via email for one-on-one support.